Welcome to the latest episode of the 25th Century Magazine podcast. I am your host, Adam Reggio, and joining me on the show today will be Leilani Farha of The Shift. Leilani is a housing advocate and a activist fighting against the inequities and the many social problems that arise from profiteering in the housing sector. And with me also will be a professor and researcher in rhetoric, communications, and artificial intelligence technology, Midyasin Maya. And together we will all be talking about the technology that is currently driving ongoing and current trends in housing, in profiteering from housing, in the concentrated ownership of housing, and how those trends are breaking and causing rifts and preventing human communities from forming as they should. And we'll be talking, most importantly, about what a vision for the future of housing can be, how contemporary technology that is currently being used for the benefit of the few can be instead used for the benefit of the many and the benefit of all our communities going forward. So with that, I'll be handing it over to myself, Leilani, and Midyasin to see what we can see on this vision for the future of all of our housing and all of our communities. Leilani, good to see you. Welcome, Leilani Farha of Make the Shift. Here to discuss the many issues involving the housing crisis. I want to thank you for being here to discuss all of this that is affecting the lives of so many Canadians, so many people throughout North America and so many places in the world, really, and all of the factors, some of the factors anyway, that are contributing to this crisis and laying the groundwork for what could be an amazing future for housing, but what could also be a bit of a dystopian nightmare of a future for housing for so many people, and trying to thread that towards the best direction possible. So if it's okay, Leilani, I'd like to start our conversation setting the sort of moral scene or ethical scene with a quote from a recent article that appeared in CBC Montreal by Erica Morris. The article has the excellent title, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of getting a good title anyway. The title is, "Every Developer Has Opted to Pay Montreal Instead of Building Affordable Housing." And the particular quote that I want to focus on here to set our sort of mood of what ideas and what perspective informs a lot of the interest in the current housing crisis is when he was asked about what social responsibilities real estate developers have to their communities and the people. Nicola Padulo, who is a real estate developer in the city of Montreal, he said that they're only really concerned with maximizing profits. He said this openly and explicitly and almost proudly. He said that legal tenants' rights protections of any kind in the law, he said, interfere illegitimately with the property development business. And he said, and this is an exact quote I have, "If people can't afford it, they shouldn't live in the city. The city is made for the privileged." So I want to ask you, Leilani, how do you orient yourself and the priorities of Make the Shift around that kind of idea, which I think I can be reasonably sure in saying that you are opposed to this attitude. So what are your first reactions on hearing a property developer say that quite so obviously and explicitly and just laying everything on the table without euphemism or anything like that?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here to be talking about what is probably the most significant social issue confronting most cities and most countries actually around the world. So a super important conversation, and I'm really happy you invited me into it. As for the comment made by the property developer, First of all, I would like to think that his opinion and position is not the norm or the main. I don't know if it is, but I would like to think that it isn't. Second thing is, I mean, it's sort of a foolish statement that he made, really. I presume he occasionally goes for a coffee at, a local cafe. I presume he may have had children that need to be taught by teachers. I presume he may need a paramedic at some point in his life. I presume he may need a firefighter. These are all the people that make cities work and run. And they are the people who cannot afford to live in the city. So to say that cities are for the affluent is ridiculous. Cities are vibrant, diverse places for everybody. And we have to figure out how it is that everyone can live in cities and have well-being whilst living in cities. And so, I mean, it's just an ignorant comment. And also it's a comment that demonstrates that a lot of folks who got into the business of housing didn't contemplate or know, they weren't told that they're in a business that is, in fact, a human right, and that maybe, therefore, their business practices have to change or be affected by the fact that it's a human right. And employers know these things when they, hire people. They know they have to play by certain rules, right? Minimum wage, that's a rule. And that's a human rights rule, actually. You can't just fire someone based on their skin color. You can't, I mean, there's a whole bunch of rules that employers play by. And they know that if they're going to employ people, they got to play by certain rules, human rights rules. And what a lot of developers and investors don't consider when they get into the business of housing is that it is a human right and that there are going to be rules they have to play by.
Yeah. I mean, what I'd like to ask you about here is, as someone who has been an activist in this for a while and has, so much knowledge and experience, not only of the economy and the economic pressures of the housing industry, but also the attitudes and the culture of the housing industry. Someone who has, talked with and worked with people on all sides of this. This is a profiteering attitude, right? The idea that the city is made for the privileged and that all housing development should be as profiteering as possible. And it's an elitist attitude. It's one that sees profit coming first. What are some of the conditions in the culture and the attitudes that you've seen, among housing developers, but also among just ordinary people thinking about what should be the business of housing? What encourages that attitude, do you think? What are the conditions that encourage that way of thinking?
Our entire system is based on that way of thinking. It's baked into our culture and systems. So it's everywhere. Of course, there are laws and policies that governments set that really enhance this. So, for example, certain real estate players don't pay corporate income tax, even though they are, in fact, corporate entities. Real estate investment trusts, we call them REITs, they don't pay corporate tax. So the government has decided that it's willing to forego a 38% tax or thereabouts from these actors to allow them to play in the housing landscape. That's just one example. If you look at the way any new development deal is structured, you'll see that there's a whole lot of giveaways that these guys, and it is mostly guys, get in order to build and develop. So 25-year property tax waiver by the local government, right? Concessions. Oh, you want to build 38 stories or 52 stories instead of just 20? Okay, well then maybe throw in a few affordable units, but by all means go ahead, right? Those sorts of permissive laws and policies, fee waivers, development fees get waived all the time. So cities forego money that they could be using for deeply affordable housing. to get developers to build. And what developers are building is based on this greed model. So they're not actually building to meet need. Or I should say, maybe I should correct myself. They're building to meet need, but the wrong need. They're building to meet developer need, investor need, so-called need, but they're not building for those who are in actual need, low income people, the people who make our cities run and work. And so, that's at the sort of legislative policy level. But we all know, walk into a bar or a hairdresser or wherever, a cafe, and what are people talking about? They're talking about real estate. I eavesdrop a lot. I love it. It's my favorite thing to do. I love going to that. COVID killed me. Couldn't go to cafes and eavesdrop. Now I'm back to my eavesdropping. And, I hear people constantly talking about how their property values are increasing and how great that is, or now with high interest rates, how they're worried about their property values. It's really baked into how we interact with housing. And that's the fundamental shift that my organization, The Shift, is trying to make away from that way of viewing housing and back to a sense that housing is just so fundamental for human life, for well-being, for employment, for so many things, right? To participate in democracy, for example, you really need a secure home. And I mean, as I said, it is so baked in. Even, of course, there's other things. Airbnb is a good example of, sold as a way for people who are struggling to maybe, make a little extra money. It has become a major investor platform. It's no longer the individual who's renting out a room in their house, like a bed and breakfast kind of situation. It's now corporations buying entire floors of buildings, or multi floors, and putting them on short-term rental platforms. So it's everywhere, and it's in our advertising, it's in our journalism, in our columns. Columnists are always writing, where should you invest your money? Oh, real estate.
Yeah. And it's one of the issues when it comes to corporate management of real estate as well is the fact that new technologies do allow corporations and corporate governance and investors to do so many more things when it comes to managing property portfolios and managing real estate that have never really been able to be done before. And one of the things that our colleague Midgerson is going to discuss a little bit with you is, and me as well, because I got notes, is that there are new technologies, particularly those driven by artificial intelligence and database management, but particularly information systems management. This is where things get really fascinating and freaky and a little bit scary as well, if you think about some of those more profiteering motives behind real estate ownership, right? Which is that now, with increasing sophistication, increasing processing power in information management, a property management company and a property and real estate ownership company can now have portfolios that are no longer constrained by geography and no longer constrained by human perception and human movement, right? So, Midgerson, what are some of the technologies that you and I have been talking about in terms of like how they're used and how properties are managed in these much more decentralized but also very centralized ways?
Adam, thank you very much for having me today. Leilani, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. The first thing is, before talking about technology and before talking about technology applied to housing, it's important to talk about power. Technology today, it's no longer more about businesses. Technology now is more about power concentration and income concentration. When you take this technology to the real estate market, to the real estate market, especially in the REITs perspective, the real estate investment trust, that's our company based on open market, open stocks. They are totally focused on deliver return to their investors, to their stakeholders. This is about power, right? So we have some technologies that includes AI, artificial intelligence, in this process. But basically, the fundamental thing that we have to keep in mind is that data. This is the secret of this thing. Artificial intelligence has two main purposes. The first one is prediction. The second one is accuracy. Accuracy, prediction, and also I would include excellence as well, right? So when the landlords, the financial landlords, big institutional landlords, they use artificial intelligence, they are using artificial intelligence to maximize the efficiency in terms of managing inventories and managing even utilities. When they buy a lot of single rental units, single family housing, they use those technologies to manage more properly and more efficiently the portfolio. But also have a list of technologies here. For example, Facebook analytics, automated valuation model. There is a startup called rexhomes.com as well. There is another startup in Montreal called squarefeet.ai that serves REITs, that serves real estate developers. And also we have another way to, another technology is called automated landlord. So this automated landlord is the technology that they use artificial intelligence to manage inventories, right? Before technology, maybe before the previous 10 years ago, taking over this new segment, it's called single family housing in Canada and United States. That was a big challenge because they didn't have technology to manage. The geography was a limitation, but now with this new application of artificial intelligence, they can just buy more effectively those single family houses and manage more effectively the single family housing. So they can also have an impact on rental, right? When you have data to work with rental more effectively, you can control, right? Yeah. You can make it more expensive. You can just reduce the price. It depends on your intention. But the thing that scares me more is the use of data-driven real estate. The data-driven real estate. Well, I mentioned Facebook analytics. So when we collect data on social media, imagine, Adam and Leilani, people now, especially here in Canada, we are amid a crisis, a rental crisis. Imagine how many people they are posting on internet and talking about their fears and talking about the fear of missing out, fear of missing a rental unit, fear of not getting an affordable housing or an affordable rental. Imagine at the other side, the real estate investors, they buy in artificial intelligence to analyze this data on social media, and they are able to identify how afraid we are, right? If they are able to identify how afraid we are, they are able to identify how open we are to accept a more expensive rental. If you are afraid, you tend to pay more for that.
Fear equals desperation in a lot of cases.
Exactly. So this is about a data-driven process based on the data that we deliver all the time on social media and not only on Facebook, but on Twitter, on Instagram, on our platforms. For example, I give you an example of a big company that works with that, Salesforce. Have you ever heard about Salesforce? Salesforce automation. They have one application called Salesforce iStan. The Salesforce iStan is able to go to the social media, go to different sources, and collect our data and process those data and deliver those data to the clients, right? So with that data, they can take measures. They can take decisions on the data that we are providing for free, and they are using that. They can afford that because they are big landlords. I'm just asking myself, about this power balance. We are facing a problem, an issue regarding power balance in this society. In the society of surveillance, there's an author called Shoshana. She has a book called The Capitalism of Surveillance. Yeah. So we are just being monitored all the time by artificial intelligence. But what are the values we are getting from this surveillance? Nothing. What they give to us, just to the service. If we use, for example, Google, Facebook, and other platforms, all the apps on internet, we deliver data, we sign the contract with them, we deliver the data, they provide us the service, but they have more power than us. Imagine, Adam and Leilani, if you just turn off Google, who are you going to be after turning off Google? We are using here a lot of applications, but we are totally connected. In order to use that, we have to give the data. So in case of the real estate, that's not different. They will do that. They're going to do that. Particularly, this example that I mentioned, SquareFeet.ai, a company based on Montreal, a startup, they do exactly the same. They use our data to identify, for example, how afraid we are, or how we can just, when we deliver those data, they deliver that data to the big landlords, and the big landlords will process that and increase and reduce, or maybe create an artificial scarcity in the market. Because when they have, imagine in Canada, they have a couple of big REITs controlling around 30%. Leilani can just correct me if I'm wrong, but that's around 30% of our units here are controlled by big corporations like Blackstone and other big corporations.
BlackRock, Vanguard, JP Morgan Chase.
Exactly.
That's right.
They can control. That's like technology, how big capitalists take control of the thing. That's my point. And they take control. That now it's easier to take control because they have a lot of data about us.
Yeah. And one of the issues about this kind of control, and I want to throw this back to you, Leilani, on this, because one of the things I want to talk about right now is that right now the issue is that the technology is fundamentally being used by folks who have excessive amounts of wealth, and that wealth gives them excessive amounts of power, and the technology augments the power that they have. But what I want to get into is, because this is a podcast fundamentally about the future and understanding what the future can be, what is the goal? Can we use some of these technologies to build an equitable housing system? And what would an equitable housing system look like that includes some of these technologies? Midgeson, you can throw in, and
Okay.
and Leilani, I want to hear your contribution on this as well very much. So
let me give you my perspective. Again, I just truly believe in the power balance. We have to think about how we can create more technology that gives people access to data. Imagine listing, right? Google, do you know how Google uses it's like a business model? If you pay more, you'll be the first.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same on Facebook, it's the same on Instagram, other platforms, the same modus operandi. Imagine I'm a landlord, a minor landlord with 2 or 3 rental units, 2 or 3 units. I'm not able to pay a lot to be the first one on Google, right? That's that thing. I will have to figure out with universities, not with the private sector, but because I think that won't happen, but with universities and research centers, work with applied research and try to develop new technologies that will give voices to people, right? Or make it more equitable, make it more even. Because with the technology, the models we have now, that's not even, right? That's not even, because that's not fair. If I have more money, they have more money, I will be the first. Otherwise, nobody will gonna just hear about me, hear about the units I have. So I truly believe that we have to work with this type of a different network, a different technology, different algorithms that will give people more transparency and access. If they have access to the data, if they have access to the other listing that's not like the same listing that Google and Facebook is providing, so it can change. It can start changing, right? But again, I see we have to, for example, Leilani, she has an amazing project that's Shift, right? The Shift. Maybe we can work together and go to a university and just show this, present this problem. Let's work together to make this shift, this technological shift. We have to do a technological shift.
Yeah. So what will housing be in an equitable future?
Well, I mean, there's an answer to that has nothing to do with technology necessarily. I mean, I could just answer, what a human rights-based housing system looks like. And then, maybe Medirson could talk about how technology fits in with that or doesn't fit in with that. But one thing for sure is we can't continue to see the cost of housing escalating, right? Rents increasing. And Medirson already said that they're using the technology to figure out how much they can raise rents based on, for example, fear factor, right? And as you said, Adam, desperation, right? And so we need a system where rents don't escalate and where rents are commensurate with household income. Well, we don't live in that system right now, right? We live in a system where we have weak tenant protections that allow landlords to raise rents. Even in jurisdictions where there's a cap, there are go-arounds on those caps. Above guideline rent increases is what they're called in this country. So we need to get a handle on that. We need to actually have governments intervene in the market. And that's like dirty words, right? Those are dirty words. Those are contrary to the neoliberal state that has been established here in Canada. We're one of the most neoliberal states around where housing is concerned, especially. And so we need to undo some of the very structures of our economy. If you look at where economic growth comes from in this country in the last few years, a huge amount of it is coming from housing transactions, renovations, construction, etc. And an economy that's basing its growth on housing is an economy that is not working for tenants or for low-income, wannabe homeowners, etc. And so, like, what we're talking about is like quite a fundamental change. Part of the problem is investors will say, well, look, there's more money floating around than ever before, and we need a place to park our money. And what are my options? Do I want them to park their money in oil and gas? Well, obviously not, right? We've got a climate emergency. And so what they say is the green alternative to oil and gas is real estate. I mean, it's which is remarkable because real estate, of course, is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, 36% or something like that. So it's actually a false thing. But there is a way in which technology could bring us back to the tenant experience or the individual experience of housing. All that data that's being mined for fear factor could be mined to determine how to be a better landlord, right? Where tenants are saying, oh my God, I'm going to be reno-evicted, a huge problem in this country, especially with our older housing stock, right? Landlords just using it as an opportunity to reposition buildings to turn what might be affordable to the people living there now into something that would become unaffordable to those people. You could use data to inform landlord practices, is what I mean to say. But there's so many ways in which technology is already being used to their advantage. I think some of it we just simply have to make unallowable. I don't know if it happens here, but in the United States, Zillow is known. It's a platform and a data a data company, and they're known to give pre-releases to the big private equity firms and those that the developers, et cetera, who acquire housing. They give them pre-listings basically so that they can intervene in the market and gobble up things that we wouldn't even know were on the market, or that a government wouldn't know is on the market, because one of the things we want is maybe for governments to start acquiring buildings rather than having these big corporate and financial actors buying them. But with technology, they're unable to do that because they don't know what's coming to market. There's this sort of inside scoop, and maybe Medearson knows more about that than I do, probably. But I have read a few articles about that. There's other uses of technology that are undermining housing, right? Like you can sit on your phone and buy shares in a real estate investment trust. You're just sitting here in my home. I can own a property in California or a piece of a property in California. I saw during the pandemic, homes were being auctioned in Greece. Investors were buying them from Russia, from other parts of Europe, from Canada, from the United States, just sitting in their homes, right? Not going anywhere. We could make all of that illegal and non-viable. But we haven't. And that's, of course, the work of maybe Medearson and the Shift together. Maybe that's what we need to do. But the vision that I have, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but the vision I have is one where housing is simply treated as a social good, as a human right, as a place that's very important to human well-being and participatory democracy. And until governments get their heads around that and lead with that vision, right? They need to lead the private market and technology in that direction. That's the role of government. They're the ones with human rights obligations that they've signed, legally committed themselves to. So for me, that's the vision.
I mean, breaking this down into what people would live through in their human lives. I mean, one of the things that I was discovering and working through on the research for this podcast was just the kind of ownership model where not only could individuals buy housing or buy shares in housing in very, very far away places, but also where individuals could become part of the owner of a housing even through not even directly buying the housing themselves, but through bond markets and the financialization of housing ownership, where we can now take housing resources, take homes, take apartment buildings, take bundles of single family homes into property management portfolios, bundle them all into a bond, and then trade the bond on a market. And if we can bundle it into a bond that is traded on the market, we can bundle it into a community trust that is managed by the members of the community themselves, that is managed by the people who live in the houses themselves and who live in the apartments themselves, right? You could have a system of housing where you don't even necessarily have landlords and tenants. One of the conspiracies that floats around the more, mirror world or unhinged parts of the internet right now is the idea that REITs and these kind of large scales property ownership of real estate is actually, and I kid you not, they believe it is a communist plot because, and the reason why is it takes ownership away from individual people and puts it in the hand of an upper management elite, right? So the idea here being, if the technology is only controlled by a few corporations for the sake of an elite, right? If that technology were managed by the people who lived in the homes themselves.
That's the point.
And the people who lived in the homes themselves were also part of the bond holders who hold those properties, who hold ownership of those properties, we could essentially create a cooperative management system that is geographically dispersed and managed using the same kind of methods, right? The whole reason why corporations can now run these large portfolios of widely dispersed single-family homes where they couldn't before is because you can stick a smart home manager in each of those homes, and then the smart home manager and the resident would interact to file reports for things like repairs, upgrades, and so on, need for new appliances, need for insulation replacement, window repair, things like that. And then there would be a distributed system run by an information management software program that would send repair crews and contractors to all those various locations. And there doesn't need to be a centralized human manager in a centralized physical location organizing it all by face-to-face conversations. And right now, all that is managed by, REITs and by large-scale corporate holders. But if those systems were owned and managed by the residents themselves, then the power would rest with the residents themselves.
That's the technological shift we have to do.
Because we can still use that technology for the sake of the residents. And indeed, there are some cases where financialization can take us beyond the typical ways the financialization is used for. Because one weird thing that is a potential benefit from this is possibly even the end of the renoviction or the end of the property transfer eviction, right? Because one problem when you're dealing with private ownership, right, with individual-sized private ownership, is that an individual ends up having to massively lower the asking price of their home if there's already a tenant in it. I know someone in my own life who had to evict a tenant in the middle of their this housing crisis because they were going through a divorce and had to sell the house, and the house's value had to be maximized, right? And so if the ownership is distributed in this way, is financialized in a way that is still controlled by residences, because the homeowners would be part of the bondholders, right? And separate from the bond, and the bondholders and the ultimate owners would be separate enough that they have an interest in simply keeping the rental income going. That could be a way in which distant ownership and large-scale communal ownership of housing can actually benefit, because the interest now is in keeping the money flowing through the bond for the sake of the bondholders, for the sake of the ultimate owners of the property. And if the rents need to be stable and the rents need to move through, and you need to prevent the default of those bonds through too many disruptions in rents as tenants change and as ownership and individual properties change, now you can keep a tenant in a property even as you sell it, even as you move it from one bond portfolio to another, right? And that's an opportunity to stabilize housing. That's an opportunity to create more sane and reasonable and long-term stable communities through, paradoxically, according to our intuitions, this kind of financialization. There are ways in which we can take this distributed ownership and manage it for the sake of people and not manage it for the sake of immediate investors.
And use the same model of technology for that.
Yes, exactly. The technologies can be applied to communal ownership and to keeping people safe in their homes rather than making things unstable through things that are out of someone else's control. A change in family status, a change in property status, the owner of a house dying and it being taken over by an heir who, has their own plans. That doesn't necessarily have to change the situation of a tenant. That doesn't necessarily have to change the situation of someone living there if we have this more distributed ownership model, and the distributed ownership model isn't being pumped and dumped for short-term profit, as unfortunately too many real estate holdings in our current, neoliberal economic framework are. And I think that is much more of a vision for a future than we are getting from the current privatized and financialized and neoliberal setup for housing ownership. Leilani, what are some of your thoughts as our special guest
Wow.
on this particular vision? I know I threw a lot out there, but
That's
you
a
know,
lot. That's a lot. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is, what we were talking about before, which is who owns the data and how is it being used. And of course, those who own the data make a huge amount of money by selling that data or, providing that data to corporate landlords, et cetera. And so breaking that is one of the key things. And we've seen what happens, and I don't want to take us too far afield, but we've seen what happens when people use data for people. And I'm thinking, yes, of Julian Assange. And, look at what it's amazing if you think about that, because there is a way in which he was just trying to make data and information available to everyday people so that we would know, so we would have increased transparency basically around a lot of things. And that's not acceptable in our society right now. That's just simply not acceptable. So, I mean, I don't want to take us too far afield down the Assange road, but just to say that this idea that Medearson brought up earlier around data and power is so true, right? Who owns the data and what they do with it. And so, I think it's interesting, Adam, to try to think through ways of breaking through that. And some other ownership models, certainly where data is used for other ownership models, is certainly the way of the future. Funnily enough, I was meeting yesterday with a community land trust here in Ottawa, where I'm situated, and they're trying to do things differently. It's a different ownership structure. It's a not-for-profit ownership structure. I met this morning with a really interesting financial outfit, developer outfit in Scandinavia, in Denmark, where their tenants, they pay market rents, but the financial model is such that while there are investors in the properties, the tenants are investors as well. Their rent is their investment, and they receive a 15% return on their annually on their investment, and as renters, which lowers their rent basically, right? I mean, they pay their rent, but then they get this bonus through their investment, so it lowers their rent. And this financial actor is rethinking tenant relations, for example. Like, it's a whole other, he described it to me as somewhere between home ownership and renting, because once you give an investor return to a tenant who's paying their rent as their investment, it changes the nature of their relationship to the property. Right. And it was fascinating. And of course, we know that in the employment sector, there are corporations that have done that, where employees, own shares in the company, and it changes the behavior. It changes simple things like whether people arrive to work on time or not, all sorts of things, right? It changes productivity. And so it's an interesting model. I'm not suggesting the Scandi novel that I'm talking about is the be all end all, because it does replicate in some ways existing models, but it's also trying to turn them on its head. So only to say, I'm with you. I have to sit down and really think about what you said in terms of how these bonds would work, et cetera. That's what the Community Land Trust is trying to do, is trying to create what are more like social bonds that would attach to help pay for the acquisition of buildings to turn them into community land trusts. And the investors they'd be going after are different types of investors, individual investors, and as well as individuals of ultra high net worth, but also institutional investors, but who want to have social impact.
Yeah, I think what we see, this idea is brilliant. This idea is fantastic. I'm also in Leilani. The big challenge is how to manage the technology. I truly believe that it's possible, but you have to find good people with good wills That's why I believe in university. That's why I believe in applied research for this project. Because if we involve, for example, IT faculties, housing advocates, we have here at Humber, we have people here, we can just talk with them about that as well. And the big challenge is managing the same challenge the REITs they had before to manage single family housings. We can do that, right? With technology, everything is possible. The difference is people, the people behind the technology. That's why I believe it's very difficult to do that with the private sector. We have to do that with universities and government.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense to me, definitely.
And in my view, you know, the most difficult part, not just universities and government, but also what I think today is one of the most difficult but necessary parts of any kind of organization for a more equitable future, which is actual organizing among community members, explaining to them what this technology is for, you know, making sure that people understand and get all on a similar page about what the point of these property management systems can be and where the benefits really lie, right? Like, one of the most interesting challenges, and by interesting, I mean frustrating and irritating challenges, is the fact that, yeah, we will be dealing with, if we're going to organize more communal ownership in this way that the Scandinavian approach does, and in the way that the approach that I brought up earlier does, one of the problems we're going to be dealing with is the misconception that people have that, you know, any attempt to bundle together ownership away from the individual is somehow oppressive of individual rights, right? People who literally believe that, like, you know, that the biggest neoliberal capitalist investment firms are in fact communists because they think that the model of housing is taking housing ownership away from the individual and bundling it all in these more financialized holdings, like bond holdings, right? And overcoming that kind of skepticism that misunderstands the key concepts of what ownership really is, right? Ownership in a community, being part of a community that together owns a whole bunch of housing, that you take a small part in playing in managing yourself, right? With other people. Being with other people is coming to be seen as a form of oppression, when at most it should be seen as a form of mild irritation. And being with other people and having to rely on other people, you know, it's difficult to do, but it's a necessary thing to do if even individuals at the working class and the middle class and even the, you know, comfortable upper middle class level are going to be empowered. Because in this constant price gouging, price raising environment that we are in, where housing is treated as a short-term investment commodity of like getting a return in, you know, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, is something that's even driving people who are stereotypically wealthy out of the housing market. You know, people who are, you know, earning incomes of potentially, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, who themselves are already being priced out of home ownership. And where that kind of, we are in a housing market where that is happening, and a housing market where that's happening doesn't make any sense. But it's how we restore and how we can use technologies and the tools that are being used to take that power away from us to take that power back.
Yeah. There is one thing that Leilani mentioned in other podcasts that I love, is that housing is the center of everything. Housing is the center of socialization. Housing is also the center of education. Housing is the center of everything. It should not be an asset like for real estate investment trusts. That's effectively a human right. It upsets me as well, Adam, because when I see what's happening in today, I ask myself, what's the future of that? That article you sent me about automated landlord talks about a rental society. That's very sad.
Yeah.
That's very sad. The rental society, where we are in that, right?
Yeah, when really the kind of thing that I'm sketching and that I'm trying to, provoke everybody to think about is a kind of everybody ownership society where even the least fortunate of us can have some kind of share in the ownership of the housing where we are, right? Housing is seen as an investment asset today when it should be seen as the kind of asset that is a condition of production and a condition of creativity.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting what you say, Adam, because if you look at what's actually being built because of the use of housing as a financial asset and a financial tool, in fact, I mean, housing is a very good tool to raise more capital, basically. That's in fact what's really going on here. If we really want to get down to it, it's about building capital more than anything. But if you look at what's actually being built as a result, it's the kind of buildings and communities that make it very difficult for people to come together as community, right? I was in Kitchener-Waterloo, settling my son in university last week, and Waterloo has all of these new luxury, they call them. I don't know how luxurious they actually are. That's a term of art in the real estate industry. It's a smoke and mirrors thing to create higher valuation on properties. They call them luxury when they're just like ordinary. But anyway, they have these towers everywhere. And it's, as you know, I mean, these are like basic principles of architecture. The lower rise a building is, the closer it is to the street, the more likely you are to have community connection. You think about the old apartment buildings, 3-story high, 5-story, and you could yell down, right? Someone came to your door, the buzzer wasn't working, you could yell down, hey, come on up, right? Well, we've lost that with all of these towers in the sky, these micro units. You can't even have friends over. You can't have a party, like, right? And I'm not being facetious here. I mean, I really think there's this spill on effect of financialization that doesn't get talked about very much. You look at what's at the bottom of so many buildings in North America when they build these sky rises. Well, who can afford the retail space in the bottom? Shoppers, Drug Mart, big national banks. What you're not seeing are the entrepreneurs, the baker, the local baker, etc. We are losing so much through this financialized model. And it goes to your point, Adam, about like what about the idea of like a whole bunch of us owning everything and we're all in it together and we're just trying to create a good society. We are so far from there. Now, I think we're going to wrap up soon and we don't want to end on a negative note. So I'm going to pass the ball back to you all to be more optimistic.
I was trying to push everyone else into optimism here, really, because one of the overall themes of this, and if I can brand the podcast and brand 25th Century a little bit on our way out as you head to what I can only presume from our preamble conversation before we started recording is your next of 47 Zoom meetings today, is that the vision I have for 25th Century as a podcast and a magazine that we're kind of working out is a vision of futurism that actually embraces the power of people to build a better society and not simply create a kind of lifeboat for the super rich to upload their brains, move to Mars, and or get a really nice apartment on an international space station. It is more along the lines of what can the future be if it really is what we dream our best life can be. And that's not the best life in terms of the most fun life or the most exploitive life or the life of someone who does like to, their goal in life is to pump and dump stocks, bonds, housing assets, whatever else they can get their hands on, so that they can accumulate as much stuff before they're 30 as possible, and then just ride an enormous wave of cocaine until their death, which is a fine way to go out in some ways, but, you know, is not a vision that all of us can take part in. It leaves too many behind. And so the idea that we can use our technologies, we can use our smart home developments to coordinate repairs among a huge number of properties and make them better places for people to live. That we can use the fact that we can, all be bondholders in a kind of financialized housing stock to ensure the security of our rental incomes and to give us all rent reductions and pieces back on the money that we spend, to live in our places, and that we can open up more places and plan around community development, less around the luxury high rise that is just a denser form of suburban isolation, and more around the community like low rise and low level skyscraper that can keep, a dense community in more spacious 10 and 12 and 8-story buildings with shops at the bottom and parks throughout, and a vision of a community that is much more ecologically and socially sustainable, and where you have to work hard if you really want to alienate yourself from a community and really dedicate yourself to alienation, rather than simply being this isolated person, this isolated figure by default. And, it's a very difficult exercise to achieve, but at the very least, it's an easier exercise to conceive of. So I hope that some of those conceptions can then filter into broader activism around housing and what we can achieve for housing in the first place. Yes. I hope I didn't steal your thunder, Leilani, because you were our damn special guest. We have worked
Not
so
at
hard to
all.
schedule this.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's all good. I'm only conscious of the time because I have to go. So-
I know, and I'm sorry. I hope
No, it's all good. It's a fascinating conversation.
and I hope you enjoy your less interesting next few meetings.
Yeah, they will be less interesting for sure.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, Leilani Farha. And I wish you the best, and I hope this certainly won't be the last time we hear from you.
No, well, this is an important conversation. We have to keep it going. Absolutely. And I like taking opportunities to vision and revision in both a kind of practical and less practical way, because I think we need to have the big vision to motivate us, and then you do these sort of smaller things, have these smaller visions, these very practical tomorrow kind of visions along the route, along the journey. So I appreciate the conversation because it led me to both places, so that's nice.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being here. 25th Century Magazine and 25th Century Magazine's podcast would not exist without our wonderful sponsors. And those sponsors include Juicebox Group Marketing, as well as TSK Wealth Planners, Preemptor AI, and CIMO, the Chartered Institute of Marketing Management of Ontario. Thank you very much to all our sponsors for all your support and the various ways that you give that support. Thank you all very much. Juicebox, TSK, Preemptor, and CIMO. You can also download or watch any podcast of 25th Century Magazine at all your favorite podcast venues. Most specifically, we are on Podbean, we are on Spotify, and you can even watch our ugly faces at the 25th Century Magazine YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube, go to Podbean, go to Spotify, and search 25th Century Magazine. You will find us, I would say, immediately. While there, you can watch the latest episodes. If you're into it, you can catch up on some of our back episodes and see some of the great conversations we have already had with a lot of interesting people about visions for the future that are a better world for all of us than certainly the one we're currently experiencing right now. And a better future for all of us here. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to all of our venues and our listeners. Remember, we are on Podbean, we are on Spotify, and we are on YouTube. You can search us there at 25th Century Magazine or 25th Century Podcast. Thank you.